I caught my son-in-law in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning scrubbing that thing at the sink like his life depended on. When he turned around and saw me standing there in my nightgown, he didn't even try to hide what he'd been doing. Instead, he looked me straight in the eye and asked if I'd like to give him a reason to do it all over again. Name is Fawn Thompson. I'm 78 years old. And if you saw me at Sunday service at Clarity Springs Baptist Church, you'd think I was just another widow who bakes cornbread for the potluck and keeps to herself. You'd never imagine that I've been living with a secret so dark it's been eating me alive from the inside out. But tonight, sitting here on my porch with a Nebraska wind carrying the scent of wheat fields and distant rain, I've decided it's time to tell you everything. Every shameful detail, every moment that led me to become someone I never thought I could be. 'Cause keeping this buried inside me is killing me slower than old age ever could. Maybe if I tell it right, you'll understand how a God-fearing woman like me ended up in a situation so twisted I can barely believe it myself. This isn't a story I ever planned to tell. Lord knows. I've spent years pushing it down, pretending it never happened, asking God to just let me forget. But some sins don't stay buried, honey. They grow in the dark like poisonous weeds, and eventually they choke out everything good that's left in you. So I'm asking you to sit with me a while. Walk with me through this memory that's been haunting me for months now. Help me carry this burden because I can't bear it alone anymore. Maybe together we can find some light in all this darkness. Some way to make sense of how love can turn into something so dangerous and how a woman my age can still find herself trapped in a web of her own making. There's more to this story than what happened that night in my kitchen. So much more. And if you're brave enough to hear it all, I promise you'll understand why some secrets are too heavy for one heart to hold. You have to understand something about Clarity Springs, Nebraska. The kind of place where everybody knows your business before you do. Where the church bells ring every Sunday morning, 8 sharp. And where the smell of Mrs. Henderson's apple pie can drift 3 blocks on a good day. The winters here bite through your bones, and the summers make the air so thick you feel like you're swimming through it. It's a town where secrets don't stay secret for long, which makes what I'm about to tell you all the more dangerous. My daughter, Clara, has been dying for 2 years now. Cancer, the doctor said, though they use fancier words that don't make the reality any softer. She's been wasting away in the bedroom upstairs, the same room where I used to read her bedtime stories when she was small. The sound of her coughing echoes through these old wooden walls at night, a constant reminder that time is running out for all of us. When Clara got sick, her husband Mark moved in to help care for her. Mark's a good man. Or at least that's what I told myself when he first started staying here. He's got those weathered hands that speak of honest work and eyes that seem to carry too much sadness for someone his age. He tends to the small garden out back, fixes things around the house that my late husband never got around to, and speaks in that soft way that people do when they're trying not to wake the living under the same roof as Mark should have been a blessing. 2 people sharing the burden of watching someone you love slip away. Taking turns sitting by Clara's bedside, making sure she takes her medicine, pretending everything's going to be fine when we both know it isn't. That's what it should have been. But somewhere between the long nights and the shared grief, something shifted. Started small. Hand on my shoulder that lingered too long when he brought me coffee. The way his eyes would find mine across Clara's sickbed. Conversations that continued in the hallway after Clara had fallen asleep. Nothing you could point to and say was wrong. Exactly. Nothing that would make the church ladies raise their eyebrows if they saw it. Told myself it was just loneliness. After my husband passed 3 years ago, this house had felt too empty, too quiet. Having Mark here brought some life back into these rooms, some warmth into corners that had grown cold. I convinced myself that what I was feeling was gratitude, nothing more. He was helping with Clara after all. He was being kind to an old woman who didn't deserve it. But late at night, when the house settled into its creaking silence, and Clara's breathing grew shallow and labored, I'd find myself listening for Mark's footsteps in the hallway. Catch myself wondering if he was thinking about me the way I'd started thinking about him. And that's when I knew I was in trouble deeper than I'd ever been in my life. The worst part wasn't the wanting, though. The worst part was that I could see the same hunger in his eyes when he looked at me. We were two drowning people reaching for each other, and neither of us cared that we were pulling each other down. And that's when everything started to fall apart piece by piece. Until that night, when I found him at the kitchen sink, washing away the evidence of what we'd become. The first time Mark really looked at me, really looked, not the polite glances you give your dying wife's mother, was on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Clara had been having one of her bad days. Couldn't keep anything down. And the doctor had just left with that expression they get when they're running out of things to try. I was standing in the kitchen, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of the new medication schedule. When Mark came up behind me, I felt his presence before I heard him. The way you feel a storm coming before you see the clouds. When I turned around, he was closer than he needed to be. Close enough that I could smell the soap he used and see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just reached past me to steady the paper that was trembling in my hands. His fingers brushed mine, and I swear something electric passed between us in that moment. Mark had this way of moving through the house like he belonged here, like he'd always been part of these walls and wooden floors. He'd grown up on a farm about 50 miles south, he told me, and his hands showed it, calloused and strong, the kind that knew how to coax life from reluctant soil. When he worked in my little garden, I'd watch him from the kitchen window. The way he'd touched the tomato plants like they were precious things, how he'd talk to them under his breath, as if they could hear him. We started having coffee together in the mornings before Clara woke up. It began innocent enough. Just two people who were up early sharing the quiet hours when the house still held its dreams. He'd sit across from me at the kitchen table, steam rising from his cup, and we'd talk about small things at first, the weather, how the corn was doing in the fields outside town, whether the Hendersons' new baby was sleeping through the night yet. But gradually, our conversations grew deeper, more personal. He told me about his childhood, about a father who drank too much and a mother who died when he was 16. Found myself sharing things I hadn't spoken about in years. How lonely I'd been since my husband died. How scared I was of losing Clara. Sometimes I felt like I was disappearing a little more each day. There was something about the way Mark listened that made me feel seen again. Not just as Clara's mother or as the widow who brought casseroles to church functions, but as Fawn, as a woman who still had thoughts and feelings and dreams. Even at my age, he had this habit of tilting his head slightly when I talked, like every word I said mattered to him, like I was telling him the secrets of the universe instead of just rambling about my worries. The mornings became something I looked forward to, maybe too. I'd find myself lying in bed before dawn, wondering what we talk about that day, what new piece of himself he might reveal to me. I started putting on lipstick before I came downstairs, telling myself it was just to feel more human, more alive, but deep down I knew it was for him. It was. During one of those coffee conversations that Mark mentioned, he'd never had children of his own. The way his voice caught when he said it, the way his eyes went distant, told me there was a story there. But before I could ask, we heard Clara stirring upstairs, and the spell was broken. We went back to being caregiver and helper. Nothing more. I couldn't stop thinking about the sadness I'd heard in his voice. The way his hands had tightened around his coffee cup, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was carrying secrets of his own, secrets that might be even heavier than mine. I didn't know then that some secrets are meant to stay buried, and that digging them up can destroy everything you thought you knew about the people you love. The night everything changed was the first real cold snap of October. The kind of Nebraska cold that seeps through the cracks in old houses and settles into your bones, making you want to pull every blanket you own around your shoulders and never let go. Clara had been sleeping for most of the day, the medication making her drift in and out of consciousness like a leaf floating on dark water. I was in the kitchen around 10 o'clock washing the few dishes we'd used for dinner when I heard Mark's footsteps on the stairs. He'd been up there with Clara for hours, reading to her from one of those romance novels she used to love. His voice a low murmur through the thin walls. When he appeared in the doorway, his face looked drawn, older. Somehow like the weight of watching someone die was finally showing on him. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the door frame and watched me work. I could feel his eyes on me, and my hands started to shake a little as I scrubbed the same plate for the third time. Finally he moved closer, picking up a dish towel without being asked, and we fell into a rhythm. Me washing, him drying, our movements synchronized like we'd been doing this together for years instead of weeks. That's when he told me about the box he'd found in Clara's closet while looking for extra blankets. Old letters, he said, tied with a faded ribbon. Love letters from someone who wasn't him, written before they'd met. The pain in his voice when he described reading them was something I felt in my own chest, a sharp ache that made it hard to breathe. I turned to comfort him. At least that's what I told myself I was doing. But when I put my hand on his arm, when I looked up into those brown eyes that were suddenly so close to mine, everything inside me shifted. The air between us felt charged, dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. Neither of us moved, for what felt like forever. Just stood there in my small kitchen with the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. That's when I realized I wasn't just lonely anymore. I was falling for my dying daughter's husband. And from the way he was looking at me, I could tell the feeling was mutual. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. Stepped back so fast I knocked over the dish soap, and we both watched it foam across the counter in thick white bubbles. Mark reached for the paper towels and I reached for the same ones, and our hands touched again. This time, neither of us pulled away. We cleaned up the mess in silence, but everything had changed between us. Every accidental brush of fingers, every moment our eyes met felt loaded with possibility and shame in equal measure. When we finished, Mark looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said good night in a voice that sounded like he was drowning. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my bed listening to the old house settle around us, knowing that Mark was just down the hall, knowing that Clara was dying upstairs, knowing that I had crossed some invisible line that good Christian women weren't supposed to cross. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Mark's face in the kitchen, the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious and forbidden at the same time. The next morning, he was already gone when I came downstairs. left a note, saying he'd gone to town for supplies, but I knew better. He was running from what had almost happened between us, the same way I wanted to run but couldn't because this was my house, my daughter, my life. But you can't run from feelings, I learned. They follow you wherever you go, growing stronger in the dark places where you try to hide them. And when Mark came back that evening with groceries we didn't really need, and eyes that wouldn't quite meet mine, I knew we were both in trouble deeper than either of us had imagined. What I didn't know was that Mark had been keeping secrets long before he came into our lives. Secrets that would make my feelings for him look like child's play compared to the truth about who he really was. It happened on a Thursday night in late October when the wind was howling through the bare branches outside, and Clara had been sleeping for nearly 18 hours straight. The doctor had warned us that she might start sleeping more as the disease progressed, but seeing her so still, so quiet, made the house feel like a tomb. Mark and I had been dancing around each other for weeks, finding excuses to brush hands when we passed in the hallway, lingering too long in doorways, having conversations that said everything and nothing at the same time. The tension between us had grown so thick you could cut it with a knife, and we both knew something was going to break soon. I was in the back garden that night trying to salvage the last of the tomatoes before the first hard frost. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but I needed to be outside. Needed to do something with my hands to stop them from shaking. That's where Mark found me, kneeling in the dirt between the withered plants, my dress hem soaked with dew and my heart pounding like I'd been running. He didn't say anything when he knelt beside me, just started helping me gather the green tomatoes into my basket. Our movements were careful, deliberate, like we were both afraid of what might happen if we got too close. But when his hand covered mine on a particularly stubborn vine, when his thumb traced across my knuckles in the moonlight, I felt something inside me crack open like an egg. Turned to look at him, and the expression on his face nearly broke my heart. He looked like a man who was drowning and grasping for anything to keep him afloat. Before I could think about what I was doing, before I could remember all the reasons this was wrong, I leaned toward him. He met me halfway, and when our lips touched, it felt like coming home and committing the worst sin of my life all at the same time. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like we were both testing the waters of this dangerous new territory. But then, his hands were in my hair, and mine were clutching the front of his shirt. And suddenly we were holding each other like the world was ending, and this was our last moment on Earth. Which in a way it was the last moment we could pretend we were innocent. The last moment we could go back to being just two people sharing grief instead of two people sharing something much more complicated and wrong. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together in the cold night air. I could taste him on my lips, could smell the soap he used mixed with the scent of dying leaves and earth. Neither of us spoke because what was there to say? We'd crossed the line we'd been circling for weeks, and there was no taking it back. We walked back to the house in silence, the basket of tomatoes forgotten in the garden. The back door. Mark stopped and looked at me with eyes full of something that might have been love or might have been desperation. He touched my cheek once so gently it felt like a prayer. And then he was gone, disappearing up the stairs to his room like a ghost. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that, touching my lips and trying to figure out what I'd just done. Upstairs, Clara was dying. Upstairs, my daughter's husband was probably lying awake thinking about kissing her mother in the garden. And downstairs I was discovering that even at 78 years old, a woman could still make choices that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But the kiss was just the beginning. What I found out about Mark the next week would make everything we'd done seem like child's play, compared to the real sin he'd been hiding from us all along. After that night in the garden, Mark and I became like two magnets, unable to stay away from each other, but terrified of what would happen if we got too close again. The house felt charged with electricity, every glance loaded with meaning, every accidental touch sending sparks through my old bones that I thought had forgotten how to feel such things. Clara's condition was getting worse by the day. She barely woke up now except to take her medication, and when she did, her eyes had that distant look that comes before people slip away forever. Dr. Morrison had started talking about making her comfortable, which was his gentle way of saying there was nothing left to do but wait. The whole town knew Clara Thompson was dying, and the casseroles and prayer cards had started arriving with increasing frequency, along with those pitying looks that made me want to scream. It was Mrs. Patterson from down the street who first planted the seed of suspicion in my mind, though I didn't realize it at the time. She came by on a Tuesday afternoon with a tuna casserole and that particular expression church ladies get when they have gossip to share but want to pretend they're being helpful. She made the usual small talk about Clara's condition and how hard this must be for all of us. But then she lingered by the kitchen window looking out at Mark as he worked in the garden. There was something in the way she watched him, something calculating that made my skin crawl. Mrs. Patterson mentioned, almost casually, that Mark reminded her of someone she used to know, a man who'd lived over in Hastings about 10 years back. She said, same build, same way of moving. She couldn't quite place where she'd seen him before, but it was nagging at her. You know how these things do. Then she looked at me with those sharp little eyes of hers and asked if I knew much about Mark's past, about his family. I told her what I'd always known, that he'd grown up on a farm south of here, that his parents were dead, that he'd met Clara at a church social in Grand Island. But even as I said it, I realized how little I actually knew about the man I'd been falling in love with. Clara had never been one to share many details about her courtship, and I'd never thought to ask. Now suddenly, it seemed like a glaring oversight. After Mrs. Patterson left, I found myself watching Mark with new eyes. The way he always seemed to know his way around town despite claiming he'd never lived here before. How he never got mail, except for the occasional utility bill. The fact that he paid for everything in cash and never seemed to have any old friends or relatives who called or visited. That night, while Mark was upstairs reading to Clara, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I went through his things, just the basics he kept in the guest room, where he'd been sleeping since Clara got too sick to share a bed. His clothes were all relatively new, nothing with memories attached. No photo albums, no letters from home, no keepsakes from childhood. It was like he'd materialized out of thin air 3 years ago when he married my daughter. The only thing that seemed personal was a small wooden box tucked in the back of the closet. My hands were shaking as I opened it, expecting to find love letters or family pictures. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. A driver's license with Mark's photo, but a different name. Michael Hartley from Kansas City, Missouri. And underneath that, newspaper clippings about a family that had gone missing from that same city about 5 years ago. I stared at those papers until the words blurred together, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The missing family, a woman named Sarah Hartley and her 2 young children, had last been seen with Sarah's husband, who had disappeared the same night they did. The husband's name was Michael, and the grainy photo in the newspaper looked exactly like the man who had been living under my roof, caring for my daughter, kissing me in the moonlight. I closed the box with hands that wouldn't stop trembling and put everything back exactly as I'd found it. But as I crept back to my own room, one thought kept echoing in my mind. If Mark wasn't who he said he was, if he'd done something terrible to that family in Kansas City, then what did that make me? And more importantly, what did it mean for Clara? Lying helpless upstairs, completely dependent on a man who might be a killer. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. After finding that box, every creak of the house, every footstep in the hallway, made my heart race like a rabbit's. I'd lie there in the dark listening to Mark move around upstairs with Clara and wonder if I was sharing my home with a monster. The worst part was that I still felt that pull toward him, that terrible attraction that made me hate myself more with each passing hour. During the day, I tried to act normal, but everything felt different now. When Mark brought me coffee in the morning, I found myself studying his hands, wondering what they might have done. When he smiled at something I said, I searched his eyes for signs of deception. The man I thought I was falling in love with had become a stranger overnight, and yet my treacherous heart still fluttered when he was near. I started paying closer attention to his habits, the little things I'd overlooked before. How he always positioned himself where he could see both the front and back doors. The way he tensed whenever a car slowed down in front of the house. How he never answered the phone, always letting me take the calls. These weren't the behaviors of a simple farm boy who'd fallen in love with my daughter. These were the habits of a man who was hiding from something. The breaking point came on Sunday morning. Clara had been having one of her rare lucid days, actually sitting up in bed and asking for tea. I was in the kitchen preparing her breakfast tray when I heard voices from upstairs. Not just Mark's gentle murmur, but Clara's voice too, stronger than it had been in weeks. I crept up the stairs, telling myself I just wanted to hear my daughter's voice again. Really, I was hoping to overhear something that would either confirm or dispel my fears about Mark. What I heard instead was worse than anything I could have imagined. Clara was asking Mark about his family again. The same questions she'd asked 100 times during her illness. But this time I heard something different in his answers. A hesitation, a careful choosing of words that made my skin crawl. When she asked about his mother, he paused just a beat too long before giving the same story he'd always told. When she mentioned wanting to visit his hometown someday after she got better, his voice got strange and tight. But it was what Clara said next that made my blood freeze in my veins. She told Mark that she'd been having dreams about a woman with long red hair and 2 little children. Dreams where they were calling for help but no one could hear them. She said the dreams felt so real, like memories that belonged to someone else. Mark went completely silent after that, and I could practically feel the tension radiating through the walls. I backed away from the door and made it to the kitchen just as Mark came downstairs. His face was pale, almost gray, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Something cold and calculating that made me understand with horrible clarity that my daughter's fever dreams might not be dreams at all. That afternoon, while Mark was out getting Clara's prescriptions filled, I made a decision that would either save us or destroy what was left of our family. I called the police station in Kansas City, Missouri. The officer I spoke with was kind but cautious. When I mentioned the name Michael Hartley and described the man living in my house, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he asked me to hold while he pulled up the file. He came back, his voice was different, urgent, focused. The Michael Hartley they were looking for had been wanted for questioning in connection with his family's disappearance for 5 years. His wife and children had vanished without a trace, and he disappeared the same night, leaving behind a house full of blood evidence and signs of a violent struggle. They'd never found the bodies, but they'd never stopped looking for him, either. The officer asked if I was safe, if I could get somewhere secure until they could send someone out. But as I hung up the phone, I realized I was trapped. Clara was too sick to move, and I couldn't leave her alone with Mark. And if I confronted him, if he realized I knew the truth, there was no telling what he might do to protect his secret. I was still standing by the phone, trying to figure out my next move when I heard the front door open. Mark was back from town, and from the sound of his footsteps, he was coming straight to the kitchen. I had about 10 seconds to compose myself, to pretend I was still the naive old woman who'd fallen for his lies. But as he appeared in the doorway with that familiar smile, the one that had once made my heart skip, I realized with crystal clarity that I wasn't just an old fool who'd been seduced by a younger man. I was a witness to something much darker, and witnesses to men like Mark had a way of disappearing, just like his first family had. The next few days passed like a fever dream. I went through the motions of caring for Clara, cooking meals, making polite conversation with Mark, all while my mind raced with the terrible knowledge I was carrying. Every smile I forced felt like swallowing glass. Every time he touched my arm or looked at me with those eyes that had once seemed so kind, I had to fight the urge to run screaming from the house. The police officer from Kansas City had promised to send someone out to investigate, but he'd warned me it might take a few days to coordinate with the local authorities. Few days felt like a lifetime when you're living with a man who might have killed his own children. I found myself checking and double-checking the locks at night, keeping a knife from the kitchen drawer under my pillow, jumping at every shadow. Clara's condition took a sharp turn for the worse. On Wednesday, she stopped waking up entirely, her breathing becoming shallow and labored. Dr. Morrison came by and gently explained that we were probably looking days, not weeks. The whole time he was talking, Mark stood beside Clara's bed, holding her hand, playing the part of the devoted husband so perfectly that I almost doubted what I'd learned about almost. But that night, something happened that erased any remaining doubts I might have had. I was up late, unable to sleep for the third night running, when I heard Mark moving around upstairs. Nothing unusual in that. He'd taken to sitting with Clara through the night, holding vigil as her time grew short. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of the closet door opening, then closing, then the unmistakable creak of loose floorboards being lifted. He was moving the box with his real identity, with the newspaper clippings about the missing family. He was either hiding it somewhere new or getting rid of it entirely. I crept to the bottom of the stairs and listened. Mark's footsteps were deliberately quiet, the kind of careful movement you use when you don't want to wake anyone. I heard the back door open and close with barely a whisper of sound. Through the kitchen window, I could see his shadowy figure, moving toward the old barn at the back of our property, carrying what looked like a small shovel. He was burying the evidence. And if he was burying the evidence, that meant he suspected something. Maybe he'd noticed that the box had been moved slightly. Maybe he'd seen the fear in my eyes despite my best efforts to hide it. Or maybe he was just being cautious. The way a man learns to be when he's been running from the law for 5 years. I watched from the window as he disappeared into the darkness beyond the barn. This was my chance. Maybe my only chance to find out what else he might be hiding, to look for anything that might help the police when they finally arrived. Moving as quietly as I could, I made my way upstairs to the guest room. The floorboard he'd been was obvious. It sat slightly higher than the others now, hastily replaced. Using a butter knife from my pocket, I managed to pry it up just enough to peer underneath. What I found there made me wish I'd never looked. Wrapped in an old pillowcase were more newspaper clippings. But these weren't about the missing family in Kansas City. These were about other disappearances, other families going back nearly a decade. Different cities, different names, but always the same pattern. A husband and father who vanished just before or just after his family went missing. There were at least 6 different sets of clippings, 6 different identities that Mark had apparently used over the years. And at the bottom of the pile was something that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped everything. A driver's license with yet another name. But Clara's picture on it. My daughter's face. But the name read Patricia Stevens. From Denver, Colorado. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Clara wasn't Mark's first wife. She was just his latest victim. The illness that was killing her wasn't natural. Somehow, someway, he was poisoning her slowly and carefully, just like he'd probably done to all the others. And when she died, he'd disappear again, taking on a new identity, finding a new family to destroy. I was still staring at that horrible fake ID when I heard the back door open downstairs. Mark was coming back from burying the original box, and here I was, crouched over his secret hiding place with evidence of his crime scattered around me. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd be able to hear it from downstairs. Moving faster than I'd moved in years, I shoved everything back under the floorboard and tried to get it to sit flat. But my hands were shaking so badly and I could hear Mark's footsteps on the stairs, now coming closer to where I was kneeling in his room with guilt written all over my face. I managed to get to my feet just as his shadow appeared in the doorway. He looked at me with those eyes that weren't kind at all anymore, just cold and calculating, and I knew with absolute certainty that my time was running out just as fast as Clara's was. Standing there in Mark's doorway with his cold eyes boring into mine, I felt like a deer caught in headlights. My mouth went dry as dust, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved or spoke. The silence stretched between us like a loaded gun, and I knew that whatever I said next would determine whether I lived through the night. Mark's voice, when he finally spoke, was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. He asked what I was doing in his room, and there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. Not anger exactly, but a kind of patient curiosity, like a cat watching a mouse try to figure out which way to run. Could see him taking in every detail, my trembling hands, my flushed face, the way I was standing just a little too close to where the loose floorboard was. I did what any scared old woman would. Ooh. I lied through my teeth. I told him I'd heard a noise and came to check on him, thinking he might have fallen or needed help with Clara. The words came out shaky and breathless, but they came out, and that was something. Mark nodded, slowly, like he was considering my explanation, turning it over in his mind to see if it held water. Then he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded as final as a coffin lid closing. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. No. My 78 years, I'd never been so terrified. Not even when my husband had his heart attack right there in our kitchen. Not even during the tornado that took out half of Clarity Springs. When I was a girl, Mark moved closer, and I could smell that familiar scent of soap and earth that had once comforted me but now made me nauseous. He reached out and touched my cheek almost gently, the same way he touched me that night in the garden when I thought I was falling in love. But now his touch felt like ice, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. He told me he'd noticed I seemed different lately, more nervous, more jumpy. He wondered if maybe I'd seen something or heard something that was troubling me. His voice was still soft, still patient, but there was still underneath it now a hardness that made it clear this wasn't really a question. It was a test, and if I failed I had a feeling I wouldn't get a second chance. Looking back, I think that was the moment I truly understood what kind of man Mark really was. Not just a killer but something worse. A hunter who enjoyed the fear in his prey's eyes. Before he moved in for the kill, he wasn't angry that I discovered his secrets. He was excited by it, thrilled by the challenge of deciding what to do with me now that I knew. But I'd lived through the depression, 2 wars, childbirth, raising a daughter, burying a husband, and watching that same daughter waste away from cancer. Might have been scared, but I wasn't broken. Not yet. And somewhere in the deepest part of my soul I found a spark of the woman I used to be. The woman who'd stood up to her husband when he drank too much, who'd fought the school board when they tried to fire the only black teacher in town, who'd never backed down from a fight when something important was at stake. So, I looked Mark right in the eye and told him the truth, part of it anyway. I said I knew he wasn't who he claimed to be, that I'd found things that suggested he'd been married before under a different name. But I also told him it didn't matter to me, that everyone deserved a fresh start, that his past was his business as long as he was good. Clara. It was a gamble, pretending I knew less than I actually did, pretending I was willing to keep his secret out of love rather than fear. But it was the only card I had to play, and I played it with everything I had. Mark studied my face for a long moment, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he decided whether to believe me or not. Finally he smiled. That same charming smile that had fooled my daughter, that had almost fooled me. He said he was grateful for my understanding, that he'd been worried about how I'd react if I found out about his previous marriage. He spun me a story about being widowed young, about changing his name to escape the painful memories, making it all sound so reasonable and tragic that I almost believed it myself. But I knew better now. I knew that somewhere in the darkness behind that smile were the ghosts of women and children who trusted him the same way Clara and I had. And I knew that my only chance of saving what was left of my family was to play along until help arrived. To pretend I was still the naive old woman who'd fallen for his lies. The next morning I did something that went against every instinct I had as a mother and a Christian woman. I went to the sheriff's office in town and told Deputy Martinez everything I knew. I showed him the phone number for the Kansas City police, gave him Mark's real name, described what I'd found in the hidden compartment. But I also made him promise to wait, to not arrest Mark until Clara was gone. You see, my daughter was dying anyway. The doctors had given her days, maybe a week at most. And as much as it killed me to admit it, she loved Mark. In her lucid moments, he was the only thing that brought her peace, the only person who could make her smile despite pain. If the police took him away now, Clara would die alone and heartbroken, wondering why the man she loved had abandoned her in her final hours. So I made a deal with the devil, or maybe with myself. I'd keep Mark secret for just a little longer, just until Clara passed. Then I'd make sure he paid for what he'd done to all those families, all those innocent people who trusted him the same way we had. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made in my life. Choosing to protect a monster for the sake of my dying daughter's happiness. But sometimes love makes you do things that go against everything you thought you believed about right and wrong. I just prayed to God that I'd have the strength to see it through, and that Clara would forgive me someday for the choices I was making in name. Clara died on a Tuesday morning in November, just as the first snow of the season was beginning to fall. She went peacefully, holding Mark's hand while I sat on the other side of her bed, stroking her hair and whispering the prayers my mother had whispered to me when I was small and scared of the dark. Her last words were to tell Mark she loved him, and the way his face crumpled when she said it almost made me forget what kind of monster he really was. Almost. The funeral was 3 days later. Half the town showed up, filling the little Baptist church with the smell of leaves and the sound of muffled sobs. Mark played the grieving widower perfectly, accepting condolences with just the right mixture of grace and sorrow, never once letting the mask slip. I watched him from across the church during the service. This man who had poisoned my daughter slowly and methodically over 2 long years. And I felt a rage burning in my chest that was hotter than anything I'd ever experienced. But I kept my promise to Deputy Martinez. I didn't say a word. Didn't give Mark any reason to suspect that his time was running out. The plan was for the police to arrest him after the funeral once Clara was buried and at rest. One more day, Martinez had said. Just give us one more day to coordinate with Kansas City and make sure we have everything we need to make the charges stick. After the burial, people came back to the house for the traditional meal. The dining room table groaned under the weight of casseroles and pies, and the house filled with the gentle hum of conversation that follows a funeral. That particular mix of grief and relief that comes when someone's suffering finally ends. Mark circulated through the rooms, accepting food and sympathy from neighbors who had no idea they were comforting a killer. Found myself watching Mrs. Patterson, who kept staring at Mark with that same puzzled expression she'd worn weeks earlier. Cornered me in the kitchen while I was refilling the coffee pot, and her voice was urgent, excited in that way people get when they finally solve a puzzle that's been nagging at them. She remembered now, she said, where she'd seen Mark before. It wasn't in Hastings like she'd originally thought. It was in Lincoln about 7 years ago. She'd been visiting her sister and had seen him at a grocery store with a woman and 2 young children. The woman had long red hair, just like in Clara's fever dreams, and she'd called him by a different name. Michael, not Mark. Mrs. Patterson had noticed them because they'd seemed like such a happy family, the kind that made you smile just to watch them together. But what really stuck with her, she said, was what happened next. She'd gone back to that same grocery store a week later, and there had been missing person flyers posted by the entrance, photos of the same woman and children she'd seen with Mark, asking for any information about their disappearance. The husband, they said, had vanished the same night they did. Mrs. Patterson's eyes were bright with the thrill of her discovery as she told me all this, but I could barely hear her over the roaring in my ears. 7 years ago. That meant Mark had been killing families for even longer than the newspaper clippings had suggested. And it meant that somewhere out there, probably in shallow graves scattered across the Midwest, were the bodies of people who had trusted him the same way Clara had. I excused myself and went upstairs, telling Mrs. Patterson I needed a moment alone to grieve. But really I needed to needed to figure out what to do with this new information. The police were planning to arrest Mark tomorrow. But what if he sensed the walls closing in? What if he decided to disappear tonight the same way he'd vanished from all those other cities, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak? From Clara's bedroom window, I could see Mark in the backyard, standing by the small garden where we'd shared that first kiss. He was alone out there in the falling snow. And for a moment he looked almost vulnerable, almost human. But then I remembered the fake driver's license, with my daughter's picture on it. The careful way he'd been poisoning her for 2 years. And the vulnerability disappeared. That's when I noticed something that made my heart stop. Mark was holding a suitcase, not one I recognized. Something small and worn that he must have kept hidden somewhere in the house. As I watched, he opened it and began placing items inside. Clothes, papers, what looked like cash. He was packing. He was getting ready to run. I flew downstairs, my mind racing. The guests were starting to leave, offering final condolences and promises to check on me in the coming days. I smiled and nodded, and accepted their hugs, all while watching Mark through the window, watching him prepare to disappear. Forever, just like he'd done so many times before. Deputy Martinez had given me his card with instructions to call immediately if anything seemed wrong. I dialed his number with shaking fingers, whispering into the phone that Mark was packing, that he was about to run. Martinez's voice was sharp with urgency when he told me they were on their way. But it would take at least 20 minutes to get units to the house. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. By the time I hung up the phone, the last of the funeral guests had left, and Mark was coming back inside, stamping snow off his boots in the entryway. The suitcase was nowhere to be seen. He must have hidden it somewhere, maybe in his car or in the barn. We stood there in my kitchen, just the two of us, surrounded by the remnants of Clara's funeral meal. Mark looked at me with those eyes that had once seemed so kind, so full of grief for my dying daughter. But now I could see them for what they really were: cold, calculating, predatory. He knew something had changed, even if he couldn't quite put his finger on what. He moved closer and I forced myself to stay still, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. When he reached out and touched my face, his fingers were ice cold against my skin. Mark told me he'd been thinking about leaving Clarity Springs, starting fresh, somewhere new. The memories here were too painful, he said. Too many ghosts. He asked if I'd consider coming with him, starting a new life together somewhere far from all this sadness. The invitation was spoken gently, almost tenderly, but I could hear the threat underneath it. This wasn't really a request. It was a test. If I said yes, he might let me live long enough to become his next victim. If I said no, well, I had a feeling I'd end up buried in that garden where we'd first kissed. Just another secret for Mark to carry to his next identity. I looked into his eyes, those eyes that had fooled me for so long, and I made my choice. Told him yes, that I'd go with him anywhere. I'd lost Clara, I said, and he was all I had left in the world. Mark smiled then, that charming smile that had been the last thing so many people had seen before he destroyed their lives. And as he pulled me into his arms, holding me close while the snow continued to fall outside, I closed my eyes and prayed that the police would arrive before he decided it was time for me to join my daughter. The police sirens pierced through the quiet November evening. Exactly 18 minutes after I'd made that phone call. I was still in Mark's arms when we heard them, still pretending to be the grieving old woman who was grateful for his comfort. But when those sirens started wailing in the distance, getting closer by the second, I felt his whole body go rigid against mine. Mark pulled back and looked at me with eyes that were suddenly as cold as the snow falling outside. In that moment the mask finally slipped completely. The gentle, grieving widower disappeared, and what was left was something that made my blood freeze in my veins. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly what I'd done. The next few minutes passed in a blur of terror and confusion. Mark grabbed my arm with enough force to leave bruises and dragged me toward the back door. His movements sharp and desperate. He was talking, saying something about how disappointed he was in me. How he'd really hoped we could do this the easy way. But I could barely hear him over the sound of my own heart pounding and the sirens getting closer and closer. We made it to the back porch before the police cars came roaring up my driveway, their red and blue lights painting the falling snow in strange shifting colors. Mark stopped dead in his tracks still, gripping my arm, and I could feel him calculating his options, weighing his chances of escape against the number of officers I could see getting out of their vehicles. That's when Deputy Martinez's voice boomed across the yard, amplified by a bullhorn, ordering Mark to release me and put his hands in the air. The sound of his voice so strong and official made something inside me snap back into focus. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a witness and I had a job to do. I yanked my arm free from Mark's grip and stumbled away from him, putting as much distance as I could between us. When I turned back to look at him, he was standing there in my backyard like a statue, his hands raised, but his eyes still fixed on me with an expression of pure hatred. That's when he spoke, and what he said made my knees nearly buckle. Mark told the officers that I was confused, that grief had made me delusional. He said I'd been making up stories about him, wild accusations born out of jealousy and sorrow. He even suggested that I might have been the one poisoning Clara, that I'd been slowly killing my own daughter out of some twisted need to keep her close to home. The lies rolled off his tongue so smoothly, so convincingly that for a moment I wondered if anyone would believe me over him. But Deputy Martinez had done his homework. As they handcuffed Mark and read him his rights, Martinez looked him straight in the eye and called him by his real name, Michael Hartley. Then he listed off the other names, the other identities Mark had used over the years. David Sterling from Colorado, James Patterson from Iowa, Robert Mills from South Dakota. 7 different names. 7 different families that had disappeared after trusting him with their lives. The look on Mark's face when he realized how much we knew was something I'll never forget. All that careful charm, all that practiced innocence, crumbled away like old paint peeling off a wall. What was left underneath was raw and ugly and utterly without remorse. As they loaded him into the police car, Mark looked at me one last time through the window. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but could easily read. You should have come with me even in handcuffs, even caught red-handed. He was still trying to control the narrative, still convinced that his way was the right way. The next few hours were a whirlwind of questions and statements and explanations. I told the police everything about the box I'd found, about the newspaper clippings, about the fake ID with Clara's picture on it. I described how I'd started to suspect that Clara's illness wasn't natural, how Mark had probably been poisoning her slowly and carefully over the course of 2 years. The hardest part was admitting that I'd fallen for him, that even knowing what he was, part of me had still been drawn to his charm. Deputy Martinez was kind about it, explaining that sociopaths like Mark were experts at manipulation, that it wasn't unusual for their victims' families to feel conflicted about them, even after the truth came. But the real shock came 3 days later when the forensics team finished processing Clara's body. The autopsy revealed something that nobody had expected. Clara hadn't been poisoned at all. She really had died of cancer, just like the doctors had said. The illness that had wasted her away over 2 years was genuine, natural, tragically real. Sat in Deputy Martinez's office, staring at the autopsy report, trying to make sense of what I was reading. Clara had died naturally. If Mark hadn't been poisoning her, then what had he been planning to do with that fake ID? Had he been documenting her illness so carefully, taking photographs of her deterioration? The answer came from the FBI agents who'd taken over Mark's case. They explained that Mark's pattern had evolved over the years. In the early cases, he'd simply killed his victims and disappeared. But more recently he'd gotten more sophisticated, more patient. He would marry women who were already sick, women who were dying naturally, and then document their decline. When they died, he'd use their identities to move to new cities, new hunting grounds. Clara's fake driver's license hadn't been meant for him to use while she was alive. It was meant to be his ticket to his next identity after she was gone. He'd been planning to become Clara Thompson, at least on paper, using her social security number and medical records to establish himself somewhere new. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and absolutely terrifying in its coldness. The other families the FBI explained had been different. Those women and children hadn't been sick. They'd been healthy, happy, full of life. Until Mark decided they weren't useful to him anymore. The newspapers had been right about those cases. Mark really had killed them, probably buried them in shallow graves scattered across the Midwest like seeds of his evil. Clara, my Clara, had simply been unlucky enough to fall in love with a monster who saw her terminal diagnosis as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. The trial lasted 6 months. I testified for 3 days, telling the jury about the man who had lived in my house, who had kissed me in my garden, who had held my dying daughter's hand while planning to steal her identity. Mark sat at the defendant's table the whole time, never showing a flicker of emotion, never acknowledging the families of his victims who came to watch justice finally being served. In the end, he was convicted on 4 counts of murder in the 1st degree. They'd found enough evidence to prove he'd killed the families in Kansas City, Colorado, Iowa, and South Dakota. The other cases were still being investigated, but those 4 were enough. Mark received 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. I'm 81 now, 3 years older, and hopefully a little wiser than I was that terrible autumn when my world turned upside down. I still live in the same house, though I've had all the locks changed, and I keep a shotgun by my bed that I know how to use. The garden out back has been replanted. Couldn't bear to look at the spot where Mark first kissed me, so I dug up everything and started over with roses. People in town treat me differently now. Some with pity, some with curiosity, some with a kind of awe that I survived something so horrible. Mrs. Patterson still brings me casseroles, though she's never quite gotten over the fact that she was right about Mark all along. She'd pushed harder with her suspicions. Maybe Clara would have died without ever knowing she'd married a killer. Maybe that would have been a mercy. I've learned something important in these 3 years since Clara died. There's no shame in being fooled by evil when it comes disguised as love. Mark was a master manipulator, a predator who'd Spent decades perfecting his act. The fact that he fooled me, fooled Clara, fooled whole communities of people, doesn't make us weak or stupid. It makes him monstrous. But I've also learned that even at my age, even after everything I've been through, there's still strength left in these old bones. There's still fight left in this battered heart. When the darkness came calling, when evil walked right through my front door and sat down at my kitchen table, I found a way to survive it. I found a way to stop it. And that's something worth remembering, honey. No matter how old you are, no matter how tired or broken or foolish you might feel, there's always a chance to do the right thing when it matters most. There's always a chance to be braver than you ever thought you could be. If my story has moved you, if it's made you think about the people you trust and the secrets we all carry, then maybe Clara's death wasn't completely in vain. Maybe some good can come from all this darkness. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who might be in danger and doesn't even know it. Keep your eyes open for the people in your life who seem too good to be true, 'cause sometimes they are. And tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know where my words are reaching, where Clara's memory is traveling. If you've made it this far with me through all these dark memories and terrible truths, then you're part of my family now. You're part of the people who helped me carry this burden when it was too heavy for one old woman to bear alone. Subscribe to hear more of my stories, because Lord knows I've got plenty more to tell. And remember, evil might be patient, might be clever, might even be charming, but it's not stronger than the truth. It's not stronger than love. And it's sure not stronger than a grandmother who's got nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. The snow is falling again outside my window as I finish this story, just like it was that night when Mark finally showed me who he really was. But this time I'm not afraid of the darkness. This time, I know I'm strong enough to face whatever comes next. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family, as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.